There are moments in life when nothing, technically, goes wrong, and yet everything changes. No shouting, no betrayal caught on camera, no dramatic exit, just a single night, and the quiet realization that the person you trusted might never have known how to protect your heart in the first place. Ethan Cole had money, power, and a life most people would envy. He was the kind of man who believed that if something mattered, you planned for it, managed it, and made sure it stayed under control. And when he met Mira, he told himself something he'd never said about anyone before. She's the one. But here's the truth no one talks about. Sometimes the most dangerous relationships aren't the ones filled with chaos. They're the ones that feel stable, until a small moment exposes a much bigger truth. Have you ever trusted someone who never actually learned how to be emotionally safe? Have you ever stayed quiet instead of confronting what hurt you? Because walking away felt easier than explaining yourself. This story isn't about cheating. It isn't about villains or victims. It's about two good people moving at different healing speeds and the damage that can happen when certainty replaces understanding. Tonight's story will show you why love isn't proven by promises, why control can look like commitment, and why sometimes the night that doesn't end a relationship is the one that reveals whether it was ever truly built on trust. If you believe love should make you feel safer, not smaller, then stay with me. And if you enjoy deep, realistic love stories that don't just entertain, but teach powerful life lessons, make sure you subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson. Because these stories aren't just told. They're meant to stay with you. Now, let me take you back to the night everything quietly changed. The night didn't announce itself as important. It arrived the way most life-changing moments do, quietly, wrapped in routine, disguised as something ordinary. Music hummed low through Ethan Cole's glass and stone house. Voices overlapped. Laughter rose and fell like background noise meant to be ignored. Nothing about the evening suggested it would alter the shape of anyone's heart. Mira stood near the kitchen counter with a half-empty glass of water, watching condensation slide down the side. She had already refilled it twice, more out of habit than thirst. Around her, people moved with the ease of those who felt they belonged. Donors greeting donors, executives greeting opportunity, smiles practiced but convincing. The house was full, yet somehow she felt removed from it, like she was standing behind glass instead of inside a room. She told herself this was normal. Large gatherings always did this to her. They made her quieter, more observant. She had learned long ago that it was safer to notice than to participate fully, safer to read the room than to take up space in it. Across the room, Ethan, doing what Ethan did best. He stood tall, jacket perfectly fitted, posture relaxed in a way that had been carefully learned over years of boardrooms and negotiations. He laughed easily, nodded at the right moments, shifted conversations smoothly from one person to the next. Watching him, no one would guess how tired he had been just hours earlier, how long he'd stood alone in his office before coming home, staring out at the city as if he were bracing himself for something he couldn't quite name. To everyone else, Ethan Cole looked effortless. To Mira, he looked contained. They had arrived together. He had offered his arm without urgency, and she had taken it without hesitation. It was the kind of gesture that didn't demand anything, and she appreciated that about him. Ethan rarely demanded. He planned. He organized. He assumed responsibility. But he didn't push. Not overtly. That was part of what made him feel safe. The fundraiser was important. She knew that. It supported community programs she had helped design, initiatives meant to reach people long before they needed rescuing. She believed in the work, even if she didn't believe in the way money often tried to simplify it. Ethan had listened when she explained her concerns weeks earlier. He hadn't interrupted. He hadn't corrected her. He'd asked questions instead. That memory stayed with her as she stood alone now, reminding herself why she was here. A burst of laughter drifted in from the terrace. Mira's gaze lifted instinctively. Through the open doors, she could see a small cluster of people gathered under soft, outdoor lighting. The city stretched behind them, glittering and distant. Ethan stood near the center of the group, drink in hand, his attention focused on a woman beside him. The woman was elegant in the unmistakable way of someone accustomed to being seen. Her hand rested briefly on Ethan's arm as she spoke, fingers light, familiar. Ethan didn't move away. He didn't lean into the touch either. He simply stayed where he was, listening, smiling politely, present. It was a small thing, so small that Mira almost dismissed it. She told herself she was reading too much into nothing, that people touched each other all the time at events like this, that Ethan was hosting, that he was allowed to be friendly, allowed to exist independently of her. She believed all of that, and yet something inside her shifted, not sharply, not dramatically, but in the slow, quiet way of a door closing without a sound. She didn't feel angry. She didn't feel betrayed. What she felt was recognition. It wasn't about the woman. It wasn't even about the touch. It was about the way Ethan stayed exactly where he was, comfortable in the moment, unaware of how it might land on someone who had learned to watch for signs long before they turned into wounds. Mira took a steady breath and looked away. She reminded herself that she hadn't asked for reassurance. She hadn't set expectations. She hadn't defined boundaries out loud. This was part of the deal she had made with herself years ago. Observe first, decide later. Still, the ease drained out of her body. Her shoulders tensed slightly. Her grip tightened around the glass. Across the room, Ethan glanced inside briefly, scanning faces the way he always did, checking that things were running smoothly. Their eyes met for half a second. He smiled at her, warm, familiar, unaware. She smiled back. The smile felt practiced. The rest of the evening passed without incident. Ethan circulated. Mira spoke to donors and partners, answered questions, explained goals. On the surface, everything worked. The fundraiser was a success. People left satisfied, impressed, inspired. When it was time to go, Ethan found Mira near the entryway. "Ready?" he asked gently. "Yes," she said, just as gently. The ride home was quiet, but not uncomfortable. At least, not in a way Ethan noticed. He talked about numbers, about follow-up meetings, about how relieved he was that everything had gone smoothly. Mira listened, nodding in the right places, offering brief responses. She had always been good at that, present enough to seem engaged, distant enough to protect herself. When they reached her place, she thanked him for the evening. Her voice was steady, her expression calm. "You okay?" Ethan asked, almost as an afterthought. "I'm fine," she said. It wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the whole truth. That night, Mira lay awake longer than usual. She stared at the ceiling, one foot resting on the floor out of old habit, grounding herself in the room. Her thoughts didn't spiral. They arranged themselves quietly, lining up pieces of information she had been collecting since the beginning. Ethan's confidence, his comfort with being admired, his assumption that good intentions were enough. She realized then that Ethan had never learned to anticipate emotional impact, only outcomes. He planned for results, not reactions. He believed that if he wasn't doing something wrong, then nothing wrong could be felt. That realization didn't make her want to leave. It made her cautious. The next morning, Ethan woke early, as usual. He moved through his routine with precision. Coffee measured exactly. Emails scanned quickly. Calendar reviewed twice. But something felt off. The sensation was subtle, like a shift in air pressure before rain. Mira's messages were shorter than usual, polite, distant. When he asked if she wanted to meet later, her reply came after a pause. "I think I need some time." Ethan stared at the screen longer than necessary. The words didn't accuse him. They didn't explain anything. They simply existed, immovable and unexplained. Time? He had planned for everything except that. He told himself not to overreact, that people needed space sometimes, that this was normal, and yet the unease settled in his chest, unfamiliar and unwelcome. He replayed the night in his head, scanning for obvious mistakes. Nothing stood out, which somehow made it worse. Mira spent that day doing ordinary things, answering emails, grocery shopping, taking a long walk through familiar streets. From the outside, her life looked unchanged. Inside, she was measuring something new. How she felt when she imagined continuing as they were. The answer surprised her. She didn't feel devastated. She felt tired of translating her instincts into silence. Tired of accommodating comfort that wasn't mutual. Tired of mistaking calm for safety. By evening, Ethan realized the distance wasn't imaginary. It was precise, deliberate, like a door left slightly ajar, not slammed shut, but no longer open. He wanted to fix it. That was his instinct. Identify the issue. Dress it, restore balance. What he didn't yet understand was that this wasn't a problem to solve. It a truth to sit with. And that night, the one that hadn't ended anything, had already begun to reveal what both of them had been avoiding. Ethan noticed the quiet first, not the absence of sound. Mira still answered his messages, still said good morning, still wished him luck before meetings, but the absence of weight. Her words no longer carried the warmth he'd grown used to. They arrived neat and contained, like items placed carefully on a shelf rather than offered by hand. He told himself not to read into it. He had learned early in life that overanalyzing feelings was inefficient. Feelings passed. What mattered were actions, outcomes, stability. And on the surface, nothing had changed enough to justify concern. Still, the silence followed him. It hovered during meetings, distracting him from conversations he normally navigated with ease. It crept in during pauses between emails, in the space where Mira's voice used to fill his thoughts with something softer than strategy. He caught himself checking his phone more often than necessary, waiting for messages that didn't come. By the third day, he reached out. "Can we talk?" he asked. The reply came an hour later. "I don't know what I'd say yet." The words landed harder than he expected, not because they were cruel, but because they were honest in a way he wasn't used to navigating. Ethan liked clarity, problems defined, solutions outlined. This was fog. When they finally met, it wasn't dramatic. Mira suggested a cafe halfway between their neighborhoods. Neutral territory, the kind of place where conversations stayed quiet out of courtesy rather than tension. She arrived early and chose a table near the window, her coat still on, hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't touched. Ethan arrived right on time. He smiled when he saw her, relief flickering across his face before he could mask it. She noticed, the way she always noticed things he thought were invisible. "How are you?" he asked, sliding into the chair across from her. Okay," she said. It was the same answer she'd given him before. This time, it carried more distance. They talked around the edges at first, about work, about schedules, about the fundraiser's success. Ethan thanked her again for her contributions, her insight, her patience. Mira listened politely, nodding when appropriate, her gaze steady but unreadable. Finally, he paused. "You said you needed time," he said carefully. "I want to understand." She looked down at her cup, watching the steam curl upward. When she spoke, her voice was calm. Too calm. I didn't know how to bring it up without turning it into something bigger than it needed to be. Ethan leaned forward slightly. "You can tell me." She met his eyes then, searching his face not for guilt, but for awareness. "That's the thing," she said. "I don't think you noticed anything was happening." He frowned, confused. "If I missed something, I want to fix it." Mira felt the familiar tightening in her chest. The word fix had always carried weight for her. It implied urgency, control, resolution before understanding. "I'm not asking you to fix anything," she said gently. "I just need you to hear me." He nodded, though impatience flickered beneath the surface. He didn't mean to rush her. He simply didn't know how else to be. She took a breath. "At the fundraiser, I realized something about us." Ethan waited. "I realized that I don't feel emotionally safe yet," she said. "I don't think you understand what that means." The words weren't an accusation. They were an observation that somehow made them harder to respond to. "I've never done anything to make you unsafe," he said, almost reflexively. "I know," she replied. "That's not what I'm saying," she explained slowly, choosing her words with care. She talked about watching him that night. Not angrily, not possessively, just noticing how easily he moved through attention, how unaware he seemed of how his comfort might feel to someone who had learned to read situations long before they turned painful. "I didn't think you did anything wrong," she said, "but I realized you weren't thinking about how it might affect me either." Ethan listened, tension building in his shoulders. "So what do you want me to do differently?" The question came too quickly. Mira recognized it immediately, the instinct to respond before fully absorbing. She felt the urge to retreat, to minimize, to tell him it didn't matter after all. That was the old pattern. She resisted it. "I don't know yet," she said, honestly. "That's why I asked for time." Ethan exhaled slowly. Uncertainty pressed against him, uncomfortable and unfamiliar. He prided himself on being dependable, on anticipating needs before they were voiced. Being told he hadn't noticed something important unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. "So you're pulling away," he said, "because of one moment." Mira shook her head. "No, because of what that moment showed me." They sat in silence after that, not hostile, just heavy. Ethan wanted to reassure her, to promise awareness, to guarantee change. He could feel the words lining up, ready to be deployed. He stopped himself, barely. "What does time look like to you?" he asked instead. Mira considered the question. "Space," she said. "Less pressure, fewer expectations." He nodded, though every part of him resisted. Space felt like risk. Less expectation felt like instability. But he agreed. Over the next few weeks, they adjusted into something looser. They met for lunch occasionally, always in public, conversations limited but respectful. Texts became shorter. Affection became cautious. Mira paid attention to how she felt, whether the distance brought relief or regret. Brought both. Ethan struggled more than he admitted. He found himself replaying conversations, searching for missteps. He drafted apologies he never sent, explanations that sounded reasonable but felt hollow. He wanted to prove something, that he was trustworthy, that his intentions were pure. What he didn't yet see was that intention wasn't the missing piece. Mira, on the other hand, began noticing something new. Without constant reassurance, she had to confront her own habits. The way she defaulted to silence, the way she assumed she would have to carry discomfort alone. She started speaking sooner. Small things at first, naming moments when she felt unsure, asking questions instead of answering them herself. Ethan listened, sometimes sometimes awkwardly, sometimes with visible effort. Their progress wasn't linear. Some days felt hopeful, others felt strained. There were moments Ethan wanted to push forward, to define what they were again, to reestablish certainty. There were moments Mira wanted to disappear back into distance, tired of explaining something that felt intuitive to her but abstract to him. They didn't fight. They didn't argue. But the tension remained, humming beneath every interaction. What neither of them said out loud was this: they were both afraid. Ethan was afraid of depending on someone in a way he couldn't manage, afraid of needing reassurance himself, afraid that slowing down meant losing control. Mira was afraid of hoping again, afraid that if she leaned in too soon, she would have to learn, once more, how to pull herself back together. Neither fear made either of them wrong, but it made love complicated. By the end of the month, something had changed. Not dramatically, not decisively, but noticeably. Ethan had stopped trying to close the gap too quickly. Mira had stopped pretending the gap didn't exist. They were still standing on opposite sides of it, but for the first time, they were looking at it together. Sometimes the hardest part of love isn't the betrayal. It's realizing that two people can care deeply and still misunderstand each other. In this chapter, nothing exploded. No doors were slammed. No cruel words were spoken. And yet, everything quietly shifted. Let me ask you this. Have you ever felt emotionally unsafe with someone who meant well? Have you ever gone silent, not to punish, but to protect yourself? If this story resonates with you, tap the like button. It helps more people find stories that reflect real life, not fairy tales. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Who do you understand more right now, Ethan or Mira? And why? If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson. We tell stories about love, boundaries, healing, and the quiet lessons life teaches us, one chapter at a time. Because sometimes the most important lessons in love are revealed in what isn't said. Ethan Cole had learned early how to build things that lasted. Not houses, though he owned more than one. Not companies, though his name sat neatly at the top of several organizational charts. What he built, piece by careful piece, was order, predictability, a life where nothing important was left to chance. It hadn't started with ambition. It started with necessity. As a child, Ethan had discovered that chaos had patterns if you paid enough attention. Bills arrived on schedule. Arguments followed rhythms. Silence often came before something broke. If he could recognize the pattern, he could prepare for it. If he prepared well enough, he could stay ahead of the damage. That belief followed him into adulthood. Long after the circumstances that shaped it had faded into memory. By the time he turned 40, Ethan's days ran with mechanical precision. He woke before sunrise, exercised exactly 45 minutes, reviewed overnight reports with his first cup of coffee. His assistants joked that he didn't need reminders. He was the reminder. Meetings started on time. Decisions were made efficiently. Mistakes were corrected quickly. From the outside, it looked like discipline. From the inside, it felt like control. He told himself it was necessary. People depended on him. Employees, investors, entire communities tied to the projects his companies funded. There wasn't room for emotional hesitation in that kind of responsibility. And yet, when he closed his office door at night, the quiet felt heavier than it should have. That was the part he never scheduled. On the evening after his conversation with Mira at the cafe, Ethan stayed late again. The city lights stretched endlessly beyond the glass, reflecting back a version of himself that always seemed composed, never tired. He loosened his tie and leaned against the window, exhaling slowly. He replayed her words, not angrily, not defensively, but with the careful scrutiny he applied to everything else. I don't feel emotionally safe yet. The phrase unsettled him because it didn't come with instructions. He was used to feedback he could implement, metrics he could improve. This felt abstract. He had never thought of himself as unsafe. He paid attention. He listened. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't cheat. He didn't lie. In his mind, those were the markers of a good partner. The absence of harm. What Mira seemed to be asking for was something else entirely. Ethan sank into his chair and opened his calendar, more out of reflex than need. The coming weeks were full. Dinners scheduled, flights booked, commitments stacked neatly, one after another. There was no space labeled uncertainty. Growing up, uncertainty had been something to escape. His father had been brilliant, but inconsistent, present one day, unreachable the next. Promises made easily, kept sporadically. Ethan learned not to rely on what couldn't be measured. So he measured everything. Grades, performance, returns, progress, emotions, he believed, would settle themselves if the structure was sound. That belief had carried him far. It had built wealth, respect, security. It had also built walls so seamlessly that he rarely noticed them. Until Mira. She had slipped past them quietly, not by force, but by patience. She didn't demand his time. She didn't compete with his schedule. She asked thoughtful questions and waited for answers. She felt like balance, and now she was asking for space. Ethan rubbed his temples, a faint headache forming. He didn't resent her for it. If anything, he respected the clarity. But clarity without direction felt like standing on a bridge with no view of the other side. At home later that night, he moved through the rooms with efficiency. Jacket hung, shoes placed neatly by the door, lights turned off in unused spaces. The house echoed faintly, a reminder of how much space success had bought him. He poured himself a drink and sat on the couch, untouched glass resting on the table. His phone lay beside it, silent. He thought about reaching out, about asking again, about explaining himself better this time. He stopped for the first time in a long while. He wasn't sure what the right move was. In meetings over the next few days, Ethan noticed a shift in himself. He listened longer, asked fewer questions, designed to guide outcomes. He caught himself hesitating before responding, unsure whether the instinct to steer was habit or necessity. Colleagues noticed too. "Everything okay?" one of his partners asked, after a meeting ran longer than usual. "Fine," Ethan replied automatically. But later, alone in his office, he acknowledged the truth. Something was changing. Not breaking, changing. Mira's absence, her partial absence, had introduced a kind of quiet he couldn't control. It forced him to sit with himself instead of moving on to the next task. He started noticing the ways he managed people emotionally without realizing it. How he smoothed over tension quickly. How he avoided conversations that didn't have clear resolutions. How he offered solutions when someone might have needed empathy instead. These realizations weren't dramatic. They didn't come with shame or regret. They came with curiosity and discomfort. Ethan had always believed that love, like everything else, could be stabilized through effort. If you showed up consistently, if you kept things orderly, if you avoided obvious harm, the rest would follow. But Mira was teaching him something new. That consistency, without awareness, could still miss the mark. One evening, while reviewing notes from a foundation meeting, he paused over a phrase he'd written in the margin earlier that day. "Impact matters more than intent." He stared at the words longer than necessary. That night at the fundraiser, he hadn't intended anything by standing too close, by allowing familiarity. In his mind, nothing inappropriate had happened. But impact wasn't about intention. It was about experience. Mira had experienced something that shifted her sense of safety. For the first time, Ethan considered that love might require anticipation, not just reaction. That being trustworthy meant more than avoiding wrongdoing. It meant being aware of how your presence landed in someone else's emotional world. The idea unsettled him. It also intrigued him. He didn't reach out to Mira that night. He let the space remain, resisting the urge to manage it. Instead, he sat with the discomfort, allowing it to exist without correction. It was harder than closing any deal he'd ever negotiated. But somewhere beneath the unease, something else began to take shape. Not certainty, not control, but the beginning of understanding. And for a man who had built his life on knowing exactly where he stood, that was both terrifying and necessary. Ethan didn't change all at once. If anything, that was the most honest part of the process. Growth arrived slowly, without ceremony, and often without his permission. It showed up in pauses, in moments where he would normally take charge, and instead waited, in the strange discomfort of not knowing what came next and choosing not to rush past it. A week after the cafe conversation, he caught himself mid-email, fingers hovering above the keyboard. The message was to Mira. He had rewritten it 3 times already. Each version sounded reasonable. Each version explained his intentions clearly. Each version missed the point. He deleted the draft. It frustrated him more than he expected. Ethan had built his reputation on clarity, on decisive action, on the belief that uncertainty was something to be resolved, not tolerated. But now uncertainty had a name and a face, and he couldn't negotiate his way out of it. Instead, he tried something unfamiliar. He paid attention. He began noticing how often people deferred to him, not just professionally, but emotionally. How conversations bent toward his comfort without him asking. How his confidence, once admired, could quietly dominate a room. No one had ever called it intimidating. They didn't need to. His presence did the work on its own. For years, he had mistaken that for leadership. Now, he wondered what it felt like to stand beside someone like that, instead of being him. One evening, he attended a small dinner with friends, people who knew him outside of work, who weren't impressed by his success. Midway through the meal, a disagreement surfaced between 2 of them. Normally, Ethan would have stepped in, reframed the issue, guided it toward resolution. This time, he stayed silent. He watched the discomfort stretch, watched them work through it themselves. The conversation was messier than he preferred, less efficient. But when it settled, something felt different, more real. He drove home, thinking about that. Mira had never asked him to change who he was. She hadn't listed demands or drawn lines in the sand. She had simply asked for space to feel safe. And in doing so, she had exposed something he'd never examined closely. His fear of dependence. Ethan liked being needed. He just didn't like needing. It made him feel vulnerable in a way he'd learned to avoid. Depending on someone else meant giving up control, and control had always been his armor. He realized then that his vow, "She's the one," had been shaped by that fear. It wasn't just affection. It was certainty. The idea that he could choose her, lock the decision in place, and never question it again. But love, he was learning, didn't work like a completed transaction. Meanwhile, Mira moved through her days with a different kind of awareness. The space she had asked for wasn't easy, but it was clarifying. Without the steady presence of Ethan's certainty, she had room to hear her own thoughts more clearly. She noticed how quickly she assumed responsibility for emotional balance. How often she softened her needs before voicing them. How silence had become her default. Not because she lacked words, but because she had learned not to expect them to be received. Distance didn't make her miss Ethan the way she thought it would. It made her miss possibility. She missed the version of connection that felt mutual instead of managed. She missed curiosity without pressure, and she recognized, with a mix of relief and sadness, that she had been participating in a dynamic that felt familiar for a reason. Mira had always been good at adapting. As a child, adaptation had kept her safe. As an adult, it had kept her functional. But in love, adaptation without expression slowly erased her. She didn't want that anymore. When Ethan finally reached out again, it wasn't with an explanation or a solution. A simple message. I'm trying to understand something. If you're open to talking, I'd like to listen. She read it twice. The absence of urgency surprised her. Did the phrasing, he wasn't asking to be forgiven. He wasn't defending himself. He was naming his intent without directing the outcome. She agreed to meet. This time, they chose a park instead of a cafe. Neutral ground again, but less contained. They walked side by side, leaves crunching softly beneath their steps. The city moved around them, indifferent and alive. I've been thinking a lot, Ethan said, after a while, about how I show up. Mira waited. She didn't fill the silence. I realized I'm good at managing situations, he continued, but not always at noticing how they feel to someone else. She glanced at him, measuring sincerity, not by words, but by pacing. He wasn't rushing. That mattered. I don't want to manage us, he said. I want to understand you, and I don't think I've done that well. The admission was quiet. No dramatics. No self-flagellation. Mira felt something loosen in her chest. I don't need you to anticipate everything, she said carefully. I just need to know you're aware that impact matters, even when intention is good. He nodded. I'm starting to... They walked in silence for a few minutes, letting the words settle. I also need to be better at speaking up, Mira added. Silence feels safer to me than disappointment. But that's not fair to either of us. Ethan looked at her then, not with relief, but with recognition. So we're both learning, he said. Yes, she replied, at different speeds. That truth sat between them, honest and unpolished. They didn't resolve anything that afternoon. They didn't redefine the relationship or make promises about the future. What they did was smaller and harder. They acknowledged the imbalance without assigning blame. They named patterns without trying to fix them immediately. They agreed to keep going slowly, not as a strategy, but as a necessity. As they parted, Ethan resisted the urge to pull her close, to reassert certainty through touch. Instead, he smiled and let her go. Mira noticed. That night, Ethan returned to his house and left the lights off longer than usual. He sat with the quiet, not as something to escape, but as something to learn from. He was still a man who valued structure, still disciplined, still decisive. But for the first time, he understood that love wasn't something you secured by deciding it was yours. It was something you earned, again and again, by how safe you made another person feel when nothing was being decided at all. Mira had always been good at listening. Not the kind of listening that waited for its turn to speak, but the kind that absorbed everything. The pauses between words, the shift in posture, the moment someone looked away. Instead of finishing a thought, it was a skill she never thought to name, because it had never felt like a choice. It was simply how she moved through the world. As a child, listening had kept her ahead of trouble. As an adult, it had made her competent, dependable, easy to work with. People trusted her quickly. They told her things they hadn't planned to say. They mistook her quiet for softness, her patience for availability. She let them, not because she lacked boundaries, but because she believed boundaries were strongest when they were invisible. That belief had followed her into every relationship she'd ever had. Mira didn't think of herself as guarded. She didn't build walls or rehearse exits. She showed up. She cared. She gave attention freely. What she didn't do was lean too far forward emotionally until she was sure the ground would hold. Hope, to her, was something you approached carefully. On the surface, her life looked balanced. She had meaningful work, projects that mattered, communities she believed in. She had friends who respected her space, routines that grounded her. She slept well most nights. She laughed easily when something genuinely amused her. But there was a part of her that stayed alert, always scanning. When someone's tone shifted, she noticed. When expectations went unspoken, she filled them in herself. When silence appeared, she interpreted it long before asking what it meant. It wasn't anxiety, it anticipation. Mira had learned early that emotional disappointment rarely announced itself. It crept in quietly, disguised as misunderstanding, as "you're too sensitive," as "I didn't mean it like that." The safest way to avoid it wasn't confrontation, it was awareness. So she watched. That habit had shaped the way she loved. With Ethan, it had felt almost effortless at first. He was consistent, predictable, calm. He didn't play emotional games or disappear when things got close. He didn't demand reassurance or make her responsible for his moods. For a while, that felt like relief. She didn't need him to understand her completely. She just needed him not to unsettle her. And Ethan, with his steady presence and measured affection, seemed to offer exactly that. But Mira had mistaken steadiness for attunement. She hadn't noticed right away. The realization came slowly, through small moments that didn't seem significant on their own. The way Ethan sometimes spoke around emotions instead of into them. The way he moved forward with decisions assuming alignment without checking. The way he seemed surprised when she needed time to process something he had already resolved. None of it was malicious. None of it was careless. It was simply unaware. Mira rarely corrected people when they misunderstood her. She adjusted instead. She softened her responses, chose clarity over vulnerability, reassurance over request. It felt easier than explaining needs she wasn't sure would be met. With Ethan, that pattern deepened. She told herself it was temporary, that once trust settled, she'd speak more freely. That safety would come with time. The fundraiser night had disrupted that belief, not because Ethan had done something unforgivable, but because Mira recognized the familiar sensation of shrinking without being asked to, of quietly accommodating a dynamic that centered someone else's comfort. Standing alone in his house that night, listening to laughter from the terrace, she had felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, the impulse to step back before she disappeared inside the relationship. That impulse had scared her. After asking for space, Mira spent long afternoons walking through her neighborhood, letting her thoughts unfold without pressure. She passed places that felt familiar. Coffee shops, bookstores, benches she'd sat on 100 times before. Life moved on around her, unchanged. Inside, she was sorting through questions she had avoided for years. Why did silence feel safer than honesty? Why did she assume her needs would be inconvenient? Why did emotional safety, for her, mean staying one step removed? She realized something uncomfortable. Her strength had limits. Listening without speaking eventually turned into self-erasure. Patience without expression became resentment. Awareness without participation left her lonely, even in connection. Mira didn't want to be the kind of person who stayed quiet until leaving felt like the only option. That awareness didn't magically make speaking easier. It made it necessary. When she thought about Ethan now, she didn't feel anger. She felt possibility, fragile, uncertain, but real. And she knew that if she was going to continue, she would have to show up differently. Not louder, just clearer. She practiced in small ways, saying no without explanation, naming uncertainty instead of masking it, asking questions instead of answering them internally. It felt awkward, exposing, like learning to use a muscle she had kept deliberately relaxed for years. But it also felt honest. Mira understood now that loving someone didn't mean adapting endlessly. It meant allowing herself to be seen before she disappeared behind understanding. And whether or not things worked with Ethan, she knew one thing for certain. She would no longer confuse endurance with love. Mira didn't announce her changes to anyone. There was no moment where she sat down with a friend and declared she was learning to speak more, or that she was done shrinking herself to preserve harmony. The shifts happened quietly, the way most real transformations do, noticed only in hindsight, after the pattern had already begun to change. She started with her work. In meetings, she stopped filling silences immediately. When a proposal felt rushed, She said so, not defensively, not apologetically, just plainly. She noticed how often people adjusted when she did. Not all of them, but enough to matter. The world didn't collapse because she took up space. No one accused her of being difficult. If anything, the clarity earned her respect. That surprised her. It made her wonder how many times she had mistaken her own caution for wisdom, when it had really been fear of disappointment. With friends, she became more honest about her energy. She declined invitations without over-explaining. She admitted when she felt disconnected instead of masking it with politeness. Some people leaned closer. A few leaned away. Both responses felt instructive. At night, when the apartment grew quiet, Mira noticed how different the silence felt now. Before, silence had been something she used to brace herself, to prepare for emotional absence. Now, it felt like a pause she could choose, not endure. Ethan occupied her thoughts more often than she admitted to herself, not in the way of longing or regret, but in analysis. She replayed moments from their relationship with new awareness. She saw how often he had waited for her cues without realizing she had stopped giving them. How his certainty had sometimes filled the space where conversation should have lived. She also saw her part more clearly. She had assumed he would notice without being told, that he would intuit emotional shifts the way she did, that if he truly cared, he would just know. That assumption had protected her from vulnerability, but it had also set him up to fail. The realization didn't excuse the hurt she'd felt. It contextualized it. When they met again after their walk in the park, Mira paid close attention to how her body responded, not just to Ethan, but to the dynamic between them. She noticed that she felt less pressure now, less responsibility to manage his reactions. The space she'd taken had changed the rhythm. Ethan spoke more slowly, asked more questions, left room she didn't interpret as perfection. She saw it as effort, and effort, she was learning, mattered more than instinct. During one conversation, Ethan asked her what emotional safety meant to her, not as a challenge, but as curiosity. She paused before answering, allowing herself the time she needed. "It means I don't have to disappear to stay connected," she said, finally. The words surprised her as much as they surprised him. He nodded, absorbing them without rushing to respond. That, too, mattered. Still, Mira was careful not to mistake improvement for resolution. She knew patterns didn't dissolve overnight. She knew that growth often came with setbacks, misunderstandings, and moments of exhaustion. What felt different this time was her willingness to stay present without abandoning herself. She didn't rush toward reassurance. She didn't pull away at the first sign of discomfort. She stayed curious about him, about herself, about the space between them. One evening, after a long day, she caught herself drafting a message to Ethan, then deleting it. The old instinct to retreat when uncertain rose quickly. She noticed it. Instead of obeying it, she rewrote the message. "I'm feeling unsure tonight," she sent. "Not about us, exactly. Just in general." The reply came a few minutes later. "Thank you for telling me. Do you want company? Or space?" Mira stared at the screen, chest tightening. Not with fear, but with something gentler. "Recognition. Company," she wrote back. That small exchange stayed with her. It wasn't dramatic, didn't solve anything, but it represented a shift. One where she didn't have to translate her feelings into silence, and he didn't rush to manage them. Later, lying in bed, Mira reflected on how much effort it took to change a habit that once felt like survival. Speaking up required courage she hadn't needed before. It meant risking disappointment instead of avoiding it, but also meant giving herself a chance to be met. She understood now that emotional safety wasn't something another person provided unilaterally. It was co-created, moment by moment, through honesty, patience, and a willingness to be uncomfortable together. Whether or not her future included Ethan, she knew this much: she would no longer rely on quiet endurance as proof of love. She would speak clearly, imperfectly, and without apology. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like strength rather than risk. The relationship didn't restart. That was the first thing Mira noticed. There was no conversation where they agreed to try again. No moment where Ethan reached for her hand and reclaimed something that had been paused. What returned between them came back without a label, moving slowly, cautiously, as if both of them understood that rushing would only repeat what had already gone wrong. They began seeing each other again, in small doses, lunches that didn't stretch into afternoons, walks that ended before dusk, conversations that stayed present instead of projecting too far into the future. Ethan didn't ask where things were headed. Mira didn't volunteer answers she didn't have. For the first time, neither of them felt responsible for defining the pace. Ethan was different, not dramatically, not in ways that would impress anyone watching from the outside. He spoke less. When he did speak, he asked more questions than statements. He paused when Mira hesitated, instead of filling the space. Sometimes he still slipped, offering solutions when she was naming feelings, but he caught himself faster now. The effort showed. Mira appreciated that. She also remained alert, not suspicious, aware. She had learned that calm could be misleading, that a lack of conflict didn't automatically mean growth. Comfort, she knew now, could exist alongside unresolved patterns if no one was paying attention. So she paid attention. One afternoon, they sat on a bench overlooking the river, the city humming behind them. Ethan talked about a project he was excited about, outlining plans and timelines, his hands moving as he spoke. Mira listened, smiling at the enthusiasm in his voice. Then she noticed it. He had already decided how her role fit into his future. It wasn't explicit. He didn't say it outright. It lived in the way he phrased things. When we could, I see us. None of it was unreasonable. None of it was wrong. But none of it had been discussed. Mira felt the old instinct rise, the urge to stay quiet, to let it pass, to adjust internally instead of interrupting the flow. She felt how easy it would be to smile and nod and deal with the discomfort later. She didn't. "Can I pause you for a second?" she asked. Ethan stopped immediately, surprise flickering across his face before he nodded. "Course, I'm realizing something," she said carefully. "When you talk about the future, you sound very certain. And sometimes I feel like being placed into a plan I didn't help make." Ethan's first instinct was to reassure. He could feel the words forming. "I just mean, hypothetically. I didn't mean pressure. I thought we were on the same page." He stopped himself. "Thank you for telling me," he said instead. "I didn't realize I was doing that." Mira studied his face, waiting for defensiveness that didn't come. "I'm not saying I don't want a future," she added. "I just want to arrive at it together." Ethan nodded slowly. "That makes sense." They sat in silence for a moment, watching the water move steadily past them. For Ethan, the conversation lingered long after they parted. He hadn't meant to impose certainty, but he saw now how naturally it came to him. Deciding had always felt like care. Planning had always felt like commitment. What he was learning, slowly, sometimes uncomfortably, was that certainty could feel like pressure when it arrived too soon. For Mira, speaking up didn't bring relief so much as steadiness. Her heart didn't race afterward. She didn't replay the moment in her head, wondering if she'd said too much. She simply felt present. That was new. Still, progress wasn't linear. There were evenings when Ethan's need for reassurance surfaced subtly. Questions about where she stood, about whether she saw potential, about how she felt now. He asked gently, but the questions carried weight. Mira felt it immediately. She answered honestly, but without rushing. "I'm here," she would say. I'm paying attention." Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes it wasn't. On those days, Ethan had to sit with the discomfort of not being anchored by certainty. Mira had to resist the urge to offer reassurance she didn't fully feel yet. Neither of them liked those moments, but neither of them ran. What Mira noticed most was how often Ethan checked himself now, how he caught patterns mid-motion, how he apologized without over-explaining when he realized he'd crossed into managing instead of relating. What Ethan noticed was how Mira stayed, how she didn't disappear when things felt tense, how she spoke sooner instead of retreating, how she trusted him with discomfort instead of protecting him from it. They weren't healed. They were practicing. And beneath the calm that settled between them, something deeper was happening, something more fragile than comfort, more demanding than certainty. They were learning that love wasn't proven by how peaceful things felt, but by how honestly they handled the moments when peace wavered. That lesson would be tested soon. Neither of them knew it yet. But the calm they were settling into was not the end of the work. It was the beginning of a more difficult, more honest phase. Comfort arrived quietly, not as excitement, not as passion, but as routine. It showed up in the ease of their conversations, in the way they no longer second-guessed plans, in the familiarity of sitting side by side without needing to fill every pause. For a while, that comfort felt like proof that they were doing something right. Mira wanted to believe that. She liked the steadiness. She liked that Ethan no longer rushed her, that he checked in instead of assuming. She liked the way he listened now. Really listened, as if her words carried weight. Beyond politeness, there was relief in not feeling watched for signs of withdrawal, in not feeling responsible for keeping things calm. And yet, beneath the surface, something tugged at her attention. It wasn't dissatisfaction. It was awareness. She noticed how easily their new rhythm settled into something familiar, almost too familiar. The conversations stayed safe. The disagreements stayed mild. They avoided the edges without acknowledging they were doing so. It was as if both of them were careful not to disturb the fragile balance they'd created. Mira recognized the pattern because she had lived inside it before. Comfort, she had learned, could become another form of silence if no one challenged it. One evening, they cooked dinner together at Ethan's place. The kitchen was warm, the lighting soft. Music played low in the background. It was pleasant. Everything a healthy relationship was supposed to look like. As they ate, Ethan talked about his day. Mira listened, asked questions, smiled at the right moments. Then he asked, casually, "Do you want to come with me to New York next month?" The question was simple. The timing was not. Mira felt the familiar tightening in her chest. Not panic, not fear, but hesitation. She noticed how quickly her mind began calculating responses that would keep things smooth. She could say yes and figure out her feelings later. She could say maybe and soften it with enthusiasm. She could say no and risk disrupting the mood. She put her fork down. "Can I be honest?" she asked. Ethan looked up immediately. "Always." "I'm not sure yet," she said. "I don't want to say yes, just because it feels easier than saying no." He nodded, but she saw the flicker. Disappointment? Maybe. Or uncertainty. It passed quickly, replaced by understanding. Or what looked like it. "That's fair," he said. But later, as they cleaned up, Mira felt the subtle shift. Not anger, not pressure, just distance. The kind that came from unmet expectation. She realized then that comfort hadn't erased their differences. It had simply softened them enough to be ignored. Ethan, too, felt the tension. He told himself he was fine with her uncertainty. He reminded himself that this was what patience looked like. But the old instinct stirred, the desire to move things forward, to regain footing through plans and shared commitments. He caught himself thinking, If she felt more secure, she'd say yes. The thought unsettled him. It placed responsibility where it didn't belong. Later that night, lying awake, Ethan confronted a truth he hadn't wanted to name. Part of him used forward motion as reassurance. Trips, plans, labels. They anchored him. Without them, he felt exposed, unsure of where he stood. Mira, on the other hand, had learned to feel safest when nothing was rushed. Their comfort had masked that difference, but it hadn't resolved it. The next time they met, Mira decided not to let it slide. "I've been thinking about something," she said, as they walked through the park again. "I feel like we've gotten really good at being calm together. But I'm not sure we're always being honest." Ethan slowed his pace. "What do you mean?" "I think sometimes we avoid the harder conversations because things feel okay," she said. "And I don't want okay to replace clarity." The words landed softly, but firmly. Ethan considered them. He wanted to disagree, to say things felt better because they were better. But something in her tone stopped him. She wasn't accusing. She was inviting. "I think you're right," he said after a moment. "I've been enjoying the peace so much that I might be avoiding what still scares me." They stopped walking. The city moved around them, indifferent to the quiet reckoning happening between them. "I don't want to lose you," Ethan said, voice low. "And sometimes I think if we keep things smooth, that won't happen." Mira looked at him gently. "Keeping things smooth won't protect us if we stop being honest." That was the moment Ethan understood something important. Comfort wasn't the goal. Connection was. And connection required friction sometimes. Questions, uncertainty, conversations that didn't end neatly. They didn't resolve everything that day. They didn't make decisions about trips or timelines. What they did instead was acknowledge that comfort, while pleasant, could become another way to avoid growth. For Mira, naming that truth felt empowering. She wasn't rejecting calm. She was redefining it. Calm didn't have to mean quieting herself. It could mean trusting that honesty wouldn't cost her the relationship. For Ethan, it meant accepting that reassurance couldn't always come from certainty. Sometimes it came from staying present, even when things felt unfinished. That night, they parted without answers, but with a clearer understanding of what they were up against. Love, they were learning, wasn't about maintaining ease. It was about choosing honesty, even when ease tempted them to stop. And that lesson, once learned, would demand more of them than comfort ever had. Nothing about the next shift in their relationship announced itself as a problem. There was no argument, no betrayal, no raised voices, or dramatic exits. If someone had looked in from the outside, they would have seen two people doing their best, communicating more, moving slower, learning from past missteps. That was precisely why it was dangerous. The boundary wasn't crossed loudly. It was crossed quietly, through assumption. It began with Ethan's foundation expanding one of its programs. the kind of initiative that attracted attention and pressure in equal measure. Meetings multiplied, decisions piled up. The familiar weight of responsibility settled back onto his shoulders, heavier than before. Mira noticed the change immediately. Not because Ethan withdrew. He didn't. If anything, he leaned in more. He talked through ideas with her, shared drafts, asked for her thoughts. On the surface, it looked like inclusion, collaboration, trust, and yet something about it felt off. She realized she was being consulted more than considered. Ethan asked her opinions, but the decisions were already forming. He valued her insight, but he assumed alignment. He spoke about outcomes, as if they were shared goals, even when she hadn't agreed to carry them. Mira felt the old tension return, the subtle pressure to adapt instead of clarify. One evening, as they sat across from each other at a small restaurant, Ethan explained a change in direction for the project, enthusiasm bright in his voice. "I think it's the right move," he said. "It'll mean more visibility, more funding. And honestly, I don't think it'll affect you too much." Mira paused. The phrase "affect you" landed heavily. She realized that without intending to, Ethan had already placed her within the structure of his decision. He hadn't asked whether she wanted to absorb the impact. He had simply assessed how manageable it would be for her. She set her glass down slowly. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course." "When did this become something you decided for both of us?" The question wasn't sharp. It was steady. That made it harder to deflect. Ethan blinked, caught off guard. "I didn't mean it that way." "I know," Mira replied. Kind of the point." Silence stretched between them. Not hostile, but revealing. Mira felt the familiar urge to soften, to explain further, to reassure him she wasn't upset, to make the moment easier. She didn't. "I think sometimes," she continued, "your confidence fills the space before I get a chance to step into it." Ethan felt the words land with unexpected weight. He searched his memory, replaying conversations, moments where he'd assumed understanding instead of checking for it. "I thought I was being collaborative," he said. "You were," Mira acknowledged. "But collaboration isn't just asking for input. It's leaving room for consent." The word consent echoed in the space between them. Ethan had always associated consent with clear boundaries. Yes or no, agreed or refused. He hadn't considered how easily it could be eroded by momentum, by certainty, by good intentions that moved too fast. "I didn't realize I was crossing a line," he said quietly. "I know," Mira said again. Don't think you would if you saw it." That was the hardest part. There was no villain here. No one acting in bad faith. Just two people navigating different instincts. One driven by forward motion, the other by careful alignment. Ethan leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "I need to learn how to pause," he admitted. "Not just for logistics, but for you." Mira felt a mix of relief and caution. Acknowledgement mattered. But she knew awareness didn't immediately undo patterns built over decades. I don't want to disappear inside your decisions, she said. Even the good ones. The conversation ended without resolution, but with clarity. For the first time, they had named the real issue. Not the project, not the plans, but the way Ethan's certainty could quietly override Mira's autonomy. Later that night, alone in her apartment, Mira reflected on how easy it would have been to miss this moment entirely. How comfort and good intentions could have carried them forward without addressing the imbalance. She understood now that boundaries weren't only about saying no. They were about being invited in before the direction was set. Ethan, back in his house, sat at his desk long after midnight. He stared at the project notes spread out before him, seeing them differently now. Where he once saw efficiency, he now saw assumption. Where he saw leadership, he now saw blind spots. The truth settled in slowly, uncomfortably. Intent did not erase impact. And love, real love, required more than good intentions. It required restraint. It required listening before deciding. And if he wanted this relationship to survive, he would have to learn how to lead without overriding, how to stand beside instead of ahead. That lesson would not come easily, but it had finally begun. The discomfort didn't fade after that conversation. It lingered, not as tension between them, but as awareness, the kind that made both of them notice things they might have once brushed aside. Words chosen too quickly. Decisions framed too confidently. Silence that arrived sooner than it should have. Ethan felt it first in his work. During a planning meeting a few days later, he caught himself doing what he always did, summarizing options, narrowing them down, guiding the room toward what he believed was the most efficient path forward. Halfway through a sentence, he stopped. He looked around the table. People were nodding, agreeing, following, and, for the first time, he felt uneasy about it. He realized how often leadership had meant momentum to him, how rarely he paused long enough to ask whether everyone felt included rather than simply aligned. Mira's words echoed in his mind, leaving room for consent. That night, when they met again, Ethan didn't come with solutions. He came with a question. "I've been thinking about what you said," he told her as they sat on opposite ends of the couch, the space between them deliberate, "about how my certainty fills the room." Mira listened, her posture relaxed but attentive. "I don't want to do that with you," he continued, "but I'm not sure how to stop without feeling like I'm losing my footing." She considered his honesty. It mattered that he wasn't defending himself. It mattered that he wasn't asking her to reassure him. "I think you don't need to stop being certain," she said slowly. "You just need to slow down enough to check whether I'm walking with you or being pulled along." The distinction settled between them. Ethan nodded. "That makes sense." Didn't solve everything. It didn't erase the pattern overnight, but it named it clearly, and naming it shifted the power it held. Mira, for her part, noticed something else rising alongside her clarity. fear. Not fear of Ethan, but fear of staying present while asking for what she needed. Speaking up had gone well so far, but she knew there would be moments when it wouldn't. Moments when her honesty might inconvenience him, or frustrate him, or challenge the ease they'd worked so hard to rebuild. She asked herself whether she was willing to risk that. The answer surprised her. Yes, because staying quiet now would feel like going backward. The next test came sooner than either of them expected. Ethan invited her to a dinner with potential partners for the foundation. Nothing formal, just a small gathering meant to build rapport. He framed it casually, almost as an afterthought. Mira hesitated, not because she didn't want to go, but because she sensed the familiar pull of expectation, the subtle assumption that she would fit easily into the role he imagined for her. She caught it before it turned into resentment. "I want to come," she said, "but I need to know what you expect from me there." The question gave Ethan pause. "I hadn't really thought about expectations," he admitted. "That's what worries me," Mira replied gently. He understood then what she was asking. Not for reassurance, but for clarity, for the chance to consent before stepping into the space. "I don't need you to represent anything," he said after a moment. "I just want you there because you want to be." She nodded. "Okay, then yes." The dinner went well, not because it was seamless, but because it was honest. Ethan checked in quietly throughout the evening, not to manage her experience, but to stay aware of it. Mira participated without shrinking, speaking when she had something to say, stepping back when she didn't. It wasn't perfect. It was intentional. Later, walking home, Mira realized something important. Boundaries didn't distance her from Ethan. They brought her closer to herself and to him. Ethan realized something, too. Restraint wasn't loss of control. It was respect. That night, as they parted, neither of them felt the need to define what they were becoming. They understood now that defining too soon had been part of the problem. What mattered was this: they were no longer moving on autopilot. They were choosing, moment by moment, to stay aware, to speak, to pause. And while that choice made things slower, more uncertain, it also made them real. Love, they were learning, didn't grow from certainty alone. It grew from the courage to notice impact, to name discomfort, and to change course before quiet resentment took root. That lesson would shape everything that came next. Sometimes the hardest boundaries to recognize are the ones crossed with good intentions. In this chapter, no one tried to hurt anyone, and yet impact still mattered. Because love doesn't fail only when trust is broken. It falters when one person's certainty quietly replaces the other's consent. Let me ask you, have you ever felt included in someone's life, but not truly considered? Have you ever gone along with a plan simply because it felt easier than speaking up? If this chapter made you think, Tap the like button so more people can find stories that teach real-life relationship lessons. And tell me in the comments, do you think good intentions are enough in love? Or does awareness matter more? If you're new here, make sure to subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson. We don't just tell love stories. We explore the emotional skills that make love sustainable. Because sometimes the lesson isn't about what was done wrong. It's about what was never paused long enough to be noticed. The distance didn't arrive with an argument. It came quietly, settling into the spaces where ease used to live. Texts still came. Plans were still made. Nothing had been withdrawn outright, and yet something between them had shifted, subtly enough that it would have been easy to miss if neither of them had been paying attention. Mira felt it first, not as rejection, but as fatigue. It showed up in the way her body responded before her mind caught up, how she hesitated longer before replying to messages, how she felt the need to sit alone after being with Ethan, not because the time together had been bad, but because it had required effort she couldn't always name. She didn't feel angry. She felt stretched. For the first time since they'd begun moving forward again, Mira noticed how much energy it took to stay emotionally present while still protecting herself. Speaking up was healthier than silence, but it was also harder. It required vigilance, awareness, and the courage to interrupt patterns before they solidified. Some days, she simply wanted rest, so she asked for space again, this time more clearly. "I need a few days to myself," she told Ethan one evening as they stood outside her apartment. "Not because something's wrong. I just need to reset." Ethan nodded. He meant to be calm about it. He reminded himself that space wasn't abandonment, that she had explained this before. Still, something in his chest tightened. "Okay," he said. "Take whatever you need." Mira watched his face carefully. She saw acceptance, but also restraint. Something unspoken held back, carefully managed. That worried her because she knew restraint could become resentment if it stayed unnamed. Over the next few days, Mira leaned into solitude intentionally. She turned down invitations, took long walks, let her phone stay silent for hours at a time. She wasn't avoiding Ethan. She was listening to herself. She asked questions she hadn't asked before. Was she pulling away because something felt unsafe again? Or because closeness, even healthy closeness, still exhausted her? The answer wasn't simple. She realized that while she had learned to speak more, she hadn't yet learned how to rest inside connection. Her instinct was still to manage either the relationship or her distance from it. Space, for her, wasn't rejection. It was regulation. Ethan experienced that same space very differently. Without Mira's steady presence, his days felt louder. Not busier, just less grounded. He found himself reaching for his phone instinctively, then stopping. He told himself not to intrude, not to over-interpret. But his mind filled the quiet with questions anyway. Was she pulling away again? Had he missed something? Was patience still the right move? Or was he wading himself into loss? He recognized the pattern now. The urge to seek reassurance through contact, through plans, through certainty. He resisted it deliberately. Instead, he sat with the discomfort. It was not something he did well. He distracted himself with work, with exercise, with tasks that offered measurable outcomes. But the unease followed him. It didn't want to be solved. It wanted to be understood. One night, standing alone in his kitchen, Ethan admitted something he hadn't before. Part of him equated closeness with stability. When distance appeared, even healthy distance, his nervous system treated it as threat. He wasn't afraid of Mira leaving. He was afraid of not knowing where he stood. That realization humbled him. When Mira reached out again, it wasn't to explain herself. It was to reconnect gently. "Do you want to take a walk tomorrow?" she asked. No qualifiers, no justifications. "Yes," he replied. "I'd like that." They walked along a quiet street the next evening, neither of them rushing to fill the silence. The air was cool, the sky dimming slowly, the kind of setting that invited honesty without forcing it. "I want to say something," Mira said eventually. I don't want it to sound like I'm pushing you away." Ethan waited. "When I ask for space," she continued, "it's not because I'm unsure about you. It's because I'm still learning how to stay connected without losing myself." He nodded slowly. "I think I'm learning the opposite," he said. "How to stay grounded without pulling someone closer, just to feel secure." They shared a small smile, not amused, but understanding. Neither of them was wrong in how they coped. They were just different. Mira processed inward. Ethan processed outward. Mira needed quiet to regulate. Ethan needed reassurance to feel steady. The conflict wasn't about intention. It was about timing and interpretation. And this time, instead of reacting to the difference, they named it. That didn't make it disappear, but it made it bull. They ended the walk without decisions or promises, just clarity. And while clarity didn't erase discomfort, it made the distance feel less like danger and more like information. Love, they were learning, didn't always pull people closer in the same way at the same time. Sometimes it required space, not to separate, but to breathe. And whether that space strengthened or strained them would depend on what they did next. The space between them did not grow wider. It grew quieter. That distinction mattered more than either of them realized at first. After their walk, Ethan and Mira settled into a rhythm that looked healthy from the outside. They checked in without hovering. They made plans without clinging to them. They gave each other room without turning absence into punishment. And yet, beneath that balance, something unresolved pressed gently but persistently against the surface. For Mira, the space began to feel necessary, but also lonely. She had learned how to regulate herself in solitude, how to return to center without relying on anyone else. That skill had once saved her, but now she wondered whether she was using it to avoid something equally important, learning how to stay when connection felt demanding. There were moments with Ethan that required emotional effort, moments where she had to name discomfort instead of absorbing it, where she had to trust that honesty wouldn't cost her closeness. Those moments exhausted her in ways solitude never did. And part of her questioned whether that exhaustion meant something was wrong, or whether it simply meant growth was uncomfortable. Ethan, meanwhile, began to notice a different fear surfacing. It wasn't fear of abandonment. It was fear of dependence. He realized how easily he could begin to rely on Mira for grounding, for emotional steadiness, for a sense of orientation outside his carefully managed world. And that dependence unsettled him. He had spent a lifetime making sure he didn't need anyone. Wanting someone was safe. Needing them felt dangerous. During one of their quieter dinners, the tension finally surfaced, not as conflict, but as honesty that had waited long enough. "I've been thinking about us," Ethan said, setting his glass down. His voice was calm, but deliberate. "And I'm not sure if the space we're giving each other is helping us grow, or just helping us avoid something harder." Mira looked at him fearfully. She felt the familiar urge to retreat, to take the statement inward and process it alone. Instead, she stayed. "What do you think we're avoiding?" she asked. Ethan hesitated. "Reliance," he said, "on both sides." The word landed heavily. Mira recognized it immediately, not as accusation, but as truth. She had learned to avoid reliance because it once came with disappointment. He had learned to avoid it because it once came with loss of control. Different paths, same destination. "I don't want to disappear into someone again," Mira said quietly. "But I also don't want to build a life where I never let anyone hold weight." Ethan nodded. "And I don't want to build a life where I control everything. Just, I never feel unsteady." They sat with that for a moment, neither of them rushing to fix it. "This is the part where people usually choose extremes," Mira said. "Either too much distance or too much closeness." Ethan smiled faintly. "And neither of those actually solves anything." What followed wasn't a decision. It was an agreement, subtle, unspoken, but real. They would stop using space as a default response. Not eliminate it, not fear it, but stop relying on it to regulate everything difficult. Instead, they would try something riskier. Staying. That didn't mean forcing conversations when one of them was overwhelmed. It meant checking in before pulling away, naming the impulse to retreat instead of acting on it immediately. It meant tolerating discomfort together instead of separately. The next time Mira felt the familiar exhaustion rise, she didn't cancel plans. She told Ethan she was tired emotionally, not of him, but of the effort growth required. He didn't try to fix it. He didn't take it personally. He stayed. The next time Ethan felt the urge to define the relationship, to anchor himself through clarity, he named the feeling instead of acting on it. Mira didn't reassure him prematurely. She listened. She stayed. What surprised both of them was how much lighter those moments felt when they were shared. The discomfort didn't disappear, but it softened. It became something they could hold together, instead of something to manage alone. They were no longer asking, "How do I protect myself?" They were asking, "How do I stay present without losing myself?" That question didn't have a simple answer, but it was the right one. By the end of the chapter, neither of them felt certain about where the relationship would lead. What they felt, instead, was steadier than certainty. They felt capable of sitting with tension, capable of naming fear without letting it decide for them, capable of building something that didn't rely on silence, control, or distance to survive. Love, they were learning, wasn't about independence or dependence. It was about interdependence, the courage to lean without collapsing, and to stand without pushing the other away. And that realization would change the way they faced what came next. The truth didn't arrive all at once. It came to Ethan in fragments, quiet realizations that surfaced when he wasn't trying to solve anything, in the pauses between meetings, in the stillness of early mornings, in the rare moments when he allowed himself to sit without an agenda. He began to notice how often his thoughts circled back to one sentence he had never said out loud. "She's the one." At the time, it had felt grounding, reassuring, like finally placing a pin on a map after years of movement. Ethan had believed the certainty itself was proof of love, that choosing Mira so decisively meant he was all in. Now, with distance and reflection, the sentence sounded different. He wondered what had driven him to say it. To himself, in the quiet, with no audience to impress. The answer unsettled him. Ethan had not chosen Mira because she challenged him. He had chosen her because she didn't destabilize him. That realization landed slowly, but when it did, it cut deep. Mira was calm, observant, self-contained. She didn't demand emotional labor from him. She didn't require constant reassurance or intensity. With her, he could feel close without feeling exposed. At least that's what he had told himself. What he hadn't acknowledged was how much that dynamic served his fear of dependence. How her quiet strength allowed him to remain centered, certain, in control. He hadn't chosen her because he wanted to grow. He had chosen her because he believed she would fit neatly into the life he'd already built. That was the devastating truth. It didn't mean he didn't care for her. He did, deeply, but care and motive were not the same thing. Love that grew from fear of instability carried its own kind of risk. Ethan sat with that understanding one evening in his office, long after everyone else had gone home. The city stretched out beneath him, lights flickering like distant signals. He leaned back in his chair, hands resting still in his lap. For the first time, he allowed himself to question something he had never questioned before. What does love look like when it's not designed to protect me? The question made him uncomfortable. He realized how much of his life had been shaped by avoidance, not of failure, but of vulnerability. He had learned to succeed because success was measurable, manageable, safe. People, on the other hand, were unpredictable. So he had learned to choose relationships that didn't demand too much uncertainty. Mira had never demanded. She had adapted. She had stayed quiet. She had given him space without asking him to explain why he needed it. He mistook that for compatibility. What it really was, he now saw, was imbalance. The night of the fundraiser replayed in his mind, not as a moment of guilt, but as a moment of exposure. He hadn't considered Mira's emotional experience because he hadn't trained himself to look for it. He had assumed that if he felt comfortable, the situation was fine. That assumption had shaped more than just that night. It had shaped his vow. Ethan closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. He wondered whether Mira had sensed this before he ever did, whether her request for space hadn't been about the woman on the terrace at all, but about the quiet realization that Ethan loved from a place of control rather than presence. The thought humbled him. For the first time, he didn't rush to defend himself internally. He didn't tell himself he had done his best, that his intentions were good, that no one was perfect. Those things were true. They were also incomplete. When Ethan thought about Mira now, he didn't picture the version of her who fit easily into his life. He pictured the moments when she hesitated, when she spoke carefully, when she asked for space, not to punish him, but to preserve herself. He realized how much courage that had taken, and how much he had benefited from her restraint, without ever acknowledging the cost to her. The truth wasn't that he had chosen the wrong woman. The truth was that he had chosen her for the wrong reasons. Now, the question wasn't whether he loved her. It was whether he was willing to love her differently. That night, Ethan drafted a message he didn't send, not because it wasn't honest, but because it was incomplete. It spoke of realization, of regret, of growth, but it didn't yet answer the most important question. What would he do differently? Love, he was learning, wasn't redeemed by insight alone. Awareness meant nothing if it didn't translate into behavior. The next morning, he woke earlier than usual, not out of discipline, but out of restlessness. He went for a long run without tracking time or distance, letting his thoughts move freely instead of in straight lines. By the time he returned home, something had shifted, not resolved, but clarified. He understood now that loving Mira meant relinquishing the version of certainty he had always relied on. It meant choosing presence over control, curiosity over assumption, partnership over placement. It meant risking dependence, not as weakness, but as trust. That was not a vow he could make quietly, and it was not a truth he could keep to himself. Later that day, he asked Mira if they could talk, not to check in, not to clarify where they stood, but to tell her something he had finally understood. "I don't need an answer," he wrote. "I just need to be honest." Mira read the message slowly. She felt the familiar instinct to brace herself, to prepare for explanation, for reassurance, for emotional labor. But something in his words felt different. He wasn't asking to be anchored. He was asking to be seen. She agreed to meet him. What Ethan planned to say would change the trajectory of everything that followed. Not because it guaranteed a future, but because it finally removed the illusion that certainty was love. And whether Mira could meet him there would depend on what he did next. They met in the late afternoon, when the day had softened, but not yet surrendered to evening. Mira chose the place, a quiet park with long paths and wide benches, familiar enough to feel neutral. She arrived first, sat with her hands folded loosely in her lap, and let herself breathe. She didn't rehearse what she would say. She had learned by now that rehearsals were another form of control. When Ethan approached, she noticed immediately how different his energy felt. Not anxious, not guarded, unsettled, but honest. They walked for a few minutes before he spoke. He seemed to be gathering something. Not courage exactly, but precision. "There's something I need to tell you," he said finally, "and it might be uncomfortable." Mira nodded. "I'm listening." Ethan stopped walking. He turned to face her fully, not pacing, not filling space. That alone told her this wasn't another explanation. It was something else. "I've been thinking about why I was so sure about us in the beginning," he said. "Why I told myself you were the one." Mira felt her chest tighten, not with fear, but attention. "And I realized something I don't like," he continued. "I didn't choose you because I was ready to grow. I chose you because you felt safe in a way that didn't ask much of me." He let the words sit there. He didn't rush to soften them. "With you," he said quietly, "I could feel close without feeling exposed. I could stay in control, and I convinced myself that certainty meant commitment." Mira felt the truth of it land, not as accusation, not as betrayal, but as confirmation of something she had sensed without naming. Ethan swallowed. "That wasn't fair to you." She didn't respond immediately. She noticed her own instinct to reassure him, to say it was okay, to minimize the weight of what he'd just said. She didn't do that. "I appreciate you saying it," she said instead, "but I need to tell you how it felt on my side." He nodded. "Please?" "I felt like I was being chosen for how little disruption I caused," she said. "Like my calm was something you relied on more than you noticed. I don't think you meant to use me, but sometimes it felt like my silence made things easier for you." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. "I think you're right. The admission wasn't dramatic, It was steady. That mattered. I don't want to love you from that place anymore, he said. I don't want to love anyone from that place. If I'm going to be with you, it has to be because I'm willing to be affected, not just comforted. Mira studied his face carefully. She looked for urgency, for desperation, for the familiar pull of reassurance. She didn't see it. What she saw was accountability without demand. That doesn't fix everything, she said. I know, Ethan replied. I'm not asking it to. They stood there, the late afternoon light stretching shadows across the path. Mira felt something unfamiliar rise. Not relief, not certainty, but choice. She realized that this was the moment where she could slip back into old patterns. She could accept his words and move on without changing anything. Or she could decide, consciously, what kind of connection she was willing to continue building. I don't need you to be certain about me, she said slowly. I need you to be curious. I need you to notice when I'm quiet, not as stability, but as information. I can do that, Ethan said, and when I can't, I'll say so. That answer mattered more than a promise. They didn't embrace. They didn't define anything. They sat on a nearby bench instead, shoulders close, but not touching, letting the conversation breathe. For the first time since they'd met, Mira felt something shift inside her, not toward safety, but toward agency. She wasn't waiting to be chosen anymore. She was deciding whether to stay. And Ethan, for the first time, wasn't anchoring himself in certainty. He was standing in uncertainty without trying to escape it. They left the park separately, not because they were pulling away, but because neither of them needed the moment to resolve into closeness. What mattered was that something fundamental had changed. The devastating truth had finally been spoken, not to destroy what they had, but to strip it of illusion. What remained was quieter, riskier, real, and now they would have to decide, slowly, deliberately, whether that truth was something they could build from, or something they needed to walk away from with honesty instead of regret. After the truth was spoken, nothing rushed back into place. There was no relief-fueled closeness, no sudden warmth meant to prove they were okay. What followed instead was a strange, unfamiliar quiet, one that didn't feel empty, but unsettled, like a room rearranged without warning. For Mira, the days after that conversation felt sharper, not painful, clearer. She noticed how often she checked in with herself now before responding to Ethan. Not out of doubt, but out of responsibility. She was no longer reacting from habit. She was choosing. That choice carried weight. She had spent so much of her life adapting that agency felt almost disorienting. There was no script for what came next, no emotional muscle memory to fall back on. She couldn't rely on silence to protect her, and she couldn't rely on certainty to steady her. She had to rely on honesty. Ethan sensed the shift immediately. Mira, whoa, still. present, still warm, but she no longer filled gaps for him. When something felt unclear, she didn't smooth it over. When he paused, she didn't rush to reassure him. She allowed uncertainty to exist between them without absorbing it. For Ethan, that was both grounding and destabilizing. He realized how often he had leaned on her calm to regulate himself. Without it, he had to learn to regulate internally, to feel uncertainty without interpreting it as danger. That was harder than he expected. One evening, as they sat across from each other at a quiet restaurant, Ethan noticed his familiar urge rise, the need to define, to anchor, to know where they stood. He didn't act on it. Instead, he said, "I'm noticing that I feel less sure lately, and I want to name that without asking you to fix it." Mira looked up, surprised. "Thank you for saying that," she replied. "How does it feel?" "Oh, comfortable," he admitted, "but also honest." She nodded. "I think that's what growth feels like." The conversation stayed there. No resolution, no reassurance, just acknowledgement. That restraint mattered. Still, the misalignment remained. Mira needed time to integrate the truth Ethan had shared, not just intellectually, but emotionally. Knowing she had been chosen partly for her non-disruptiveness changed how she saw their past. It didn't erase the good moments, but it reframed them. She needed space to grieve the version of the relationship she thought she was in. Ethan, meanwhile, felt the pull to move forward, to prove through action that he had changed, to demonstrate awareness before impatience turned inward. Their healing timelines were no longer aligned, and for the first time, they both saw it clearly. The tension surfaced during a walk one evening, the air heavy with approaching rain. "I feel like we're standing still," Ethan said carefully. "Not in a bad way. I just don't know what stillness means anymore." Mira slowed her pace. "For me, it means making sure I don't go back to old patterns, just because forward motion feels safer." He nodded. "And for me, forward motion feels like reassurance." They stopped walking. "That's the problem," Mira said gently. "We're looking for different things from the same moment." Ethan exhaled slowly. "So what do we do?" Mira didn't answer immediately. She wasn't avoiding the question. She was respecting it. "I think," she said finally, "we stop trying to sync our healing timelines." He frowned slightly. "What does that look like?" "It looks like letting me take longer, without interpreting it as rejection," she said, "and letting you feel unsettled, without trying to resolve it through me." The honesty stung, not because it was harsh, but because it was accurate. Ethan realized how much work that would require of him. Patience without reassurance. Presence without progress markers. Trust without guarantees. It was the opposite of how he had built everything else in his life. "I can try," he said. Mira smiled softly. "Trying is enough. For now." They continued walking, the rain beginning to fall lightly around them. Neither of them knew how long this phase would last. Weeks, months, maybe longer. What they knew was that forcing alignment would undo everything they'd learned. Love, they were discovering, wasn't about healing at the same pace. It was about allowing different speeds without turning them into threats. And whether they could do that without resentment, without retreat, would determine not just the future of their relationship, but the kind of people they were becoming inside it. The hardest part wasn't waiting, was resisting the urge to explain the waiting. Mira felt it every time someone asked how things were going with Ethan. She gave careful answers, honest, but incomplete. Not because she was hiding anything, but because she didn't yet have language for something that was still forming. She wasn't unsure of him. She was unsure of herself inside the relationship. That distinction mattered. There were days when the misalignment between them felt manageable, almost gentle. They met for coffee, shared stories, laughed easily. On those days, Mira wondered if she was overthinking everything. If perhaps growth really did feel this slow, this quiet. Then there were days when the difference in their timelines pressed hard against her ribs. Ethan would reach for her hand a little longer than she expected. He would talk about the future with careful phrasing, trying not to assume but still revealing hope. Mira felt the pull to match his energy, to meet him where he was emotionally, even if she wasn't ready yet. That pull frightened her more than distance ever had. She recognized it now as a familiar danger, adjusting her pace to keep someone close. One evening, sitting on the floor of her apartment with her back against the couch, Mira let herself admit something she hadn't wanted to say out loud. She wasn't afraid of losing Ethan. She was afraid of losing herself again in the effort to be chosen. That realization didn't make her want to leave. It made her want to slow down even more. Ethan, on his side, felt a different tension building. He had named his fear of dependence, acknowledged his tendency toward control, and committed, internally, to doing better. But now, he was confronting a new discomfort. Change without immediate reward. He was doing the work. He was showing restraint. He was listening more than speaking, and still, the future felt suspended. Part of him wondered when growth would turn into movement, when patience would become progress, when the work would produce something solid he could point to and say, "Here, this is what wet building." He didn't voice that frustration immediately. He recognized it as old wiring, the desire to measure value by outcomes. He tried to sit with it. Some days he succeeded. Other days, the quiet gnawed at him. The turning point came during a conversation neither of them planned to be difficult. They were sitting across from each other at Ethan's dining table, plates pushed aside, the city humming faintly beyond the windows. The mood was calm, familiar, too familiar. "I need to check in about something," Ethan said, breaking the silence. Mira looked up, attentive. "I feel like I'm holding myself back all the time," he continued, not in a resentful way, just carefully. and I don't know how long I'm supposed to do that." Mira felt the words settle in her chest. She recognized the honesty and the pressure beneath it. "I don't want you to hold yourself back," she said. "I just don't want you to move faster than I can stay present." He nodded, but his jaw tightened slightly. And what if those two things never line up? The question hung between them, heavier than any they'd asked before. Mira didn't rush to soothe it. "I think that's the risk," she said quietly. Not knowing, Ethan leaned back in his chair, exhaling. "That's hard for me." "I know," she replied. "It's hard for me, too. Just in a different way." They sat there, the honesty stripping away any illusion that patience was painless. This was the moment when resentment could have crept in, when either of them could have framed the other as the obstacle. Too slow, too guarded, too demanding, too unsure. Instead, they chose something else. "What would it look like?" Ethan asked slowly. "If we stopped treating alignment as the goal?" Mira considered the question. "Might look like staying curious instead of committed to an outcome," she said. "Letting this be what it is, without forcing it to become something else." "That scares me," he admitted. She nodded. "Me too." But fear, they were learning, didn't always mean danger. Sometimes it meant truth. They didn't resolve the misalignment that night. They named it fully, and that was enough. Naming it removed the pressure to pretend they were closer than they were, or farther apart than they wanted to be. In the days that followed, something subtle shifted again. Ethan stopped waiting for reassurance to justify his patience. He focused instead on whether his behavior aligned with the kind of partner he wanted to be, regardless of outcome. Mira stopped bracing herself for a decision she might have to make. She allowed herself to be present without constantly scanning for an exit. The misalignment didn't disappear, but it softened. It became less of a threat and more of a shared reality, one they could acknowledge without blame. Love they were discovering wasn't proven by perfect timing. It was tested by what you did when timing refused to cooperate. And for the first time, neither of them felt like they were racing against the clock. They were simply moving, slowly, unevenly, towards something healthier than anything they'd known before. Whether that path led forward together or apart, they were finally willing to walk it honestly. The change wasn't dramatic enough for anyone else to notice. There were no declarations, no turning points that could be pointed to later and labeled that's when everything shifted. What happened instead was quieter and far more difficult. They stopped performing progress. Ethan no longer measured the relationship by how calm things felt or how often they saw each other. Mira no longer evaluated each interaction for signs of danger or reassurance. Without realizing it at first, they both let go of the idea that love had to look like something specific in order to be valid. That release brought an unexpected kind of freedom. For Mira, it showed up as honesty without strategy. When she felt tired, She said so, without wrapping it in explanations meant to soften the impact. When she felt close, she allowed that too, without immediately questioning whether it was premature. She noticed how different it felt to express herself without managing the outcome. Some days, that honesty brought them closer. The other days, it didn't. And for the first time, that didn't feel like failure. Ethan experienced the shift internally. He noticed how often he had once looked for signs, confirmation that things were moving forward, that his patience was paying off, that his restraint was being rewarded. Without those markers, he had to confront a deeper question. Who am I being when no one is affirming me? The answer mattered more than he expected. He realized he was becoming more deliberate, not less confident, but less driven by urgency. He listened without scanning for what came next. He stayed present without trying to secure the moment. That presence wasn't easy. There were still moments when fear flared, when Mira's quiet made him wonder whether he was losing ground, when her need for space activated the old instinct to anchor himself through plans or promises. This time, he noticed the fear without acting on it. That was new. The real test came unexpectedly, during an ordinary evening that held no obvious stakes. They were sitting on opposite ends of the couch, a movie playing quietly in the background. Mira leaned back, legs tucked beneath her, eyes on the screen, but mind elsewhere. Ethan glanced at her, feeling a familiar warmth and a familiar urge. He wanted to reach out, to close the distance, to turn closeness into reassurance. He didn't. Instead, he asked, "How are you feeling right now?" The question wasn't loaded. It wasn't strategic. It didn't come with expectation. Mira considered it, honestly. "Present," she said, "a little tired." "But here," Ethan nodded. "Me too." They sat like that for a while, side by side, not touching, not pulling away. Mira noticed something important then. She didn't feel the pressure to move closer in order to keep him engaged. She didn't feel the need to explain herself or offer emotional availability on demand. She felt loud. That sense of allowance softened something in her she hadn't known was still guarded. Later, when she did lean into him, it came naturally, not as a response to expectation, but as a choice. Ethan felt the difference immediately. The closeness didn't feel claimed. It felt offered. He rested his arm around her, without tightening it, without anchoring himself in the gesture. He let the moment be what it was: warm, temporary, real. Afterward, Mira didn't pull away out of reflex. Ethan didn't interpret the distance as loss. They were practicing something new. Not reassurance, not endurance, not certainty, consistency, not the kind that demanded predictability, but the kind that showed up in behavior, even when emotions fluctuated. In the days that followed, that consistency began to shape their interactions. Ethan showed up when he said he would, without using reliability as leverage. Mira spoke when something felt off, without waiting for it to grow sharp enough to justify itself. There were still misunderstandings, still moments when Ethan moved faster than Mira could follow, or when Mira slowed down in ways that tested Ethan's patience. But now, those moments were addressed early, before they hardened into patterns. What surprised both of them was how unspectacular this phase felt. No fireworks, no grand gestures, no sweeping declarations. Just two people choosing, again and again, to act in ways that didn't reopen old wounds. Mira realized she no longer felt like she was bracing herself inside the relationship. She didn't feel the need to monitor Ethan's moods or anticipate his reactions. She trusted that if something mattered, it could be spoken. Ethan realized he no longer needed to secure the relationship to feel steady. He trusted himself to remain present, even when outcomes were unclear. That trust, internal, not mutual, changed everything. They weren't healed, but they were healthier. And for the first time, since the night that had quietly shifted everything, neither of them felt like love was something they had to protect themselves from. It felt like something they could practice, imperfectly, consistently, without trying to turn it into a promise before it was ready. What remained was one final test, not of love, but of growth, and whether the patterns they were building could hold when life asked more of them than patience alone. The test didn't come dressed as conflict. It arrived as opportunity. Ethan received the call on a Tuesday morning, halfway through a list of emails he had already deprioritized twice. The foundation had been invited to lead a multi-city initiative, larger scale, longer timeline, heavier visibility. The kind of project that once would have energized him immediately, pulled him forward without hesitation. He listened, asked questions, took notes. When the call ended, he didn't feel triumphant. He felt careful. In the past, Ethan would have mapped out the implications instantly. Travel schedules, staffing changes, personal adjustments. He would have shared the news with Mira framed as momentum, as something exciting they could step into together. This time, he paused. He noticed the urge to include her before he had clarity. He noticed the instinct to measure her reaction in advance, to predict whether the opportunity would bring them closer or push them apart. He didn't want to do either. That evening, when they met for dinner, he told her simply, "I got an offer today," he said. "It's significant, and I'm not sure yet what I want to do with it." Mira looked at him, attentive but unguarded. "How does it feel?" "Like something that could change my life," he said honestly. "But I don't want to decide from urgency." She nodded. "I appreciate you telling me, without deciding first." That response stayed with him. They talked through it, not as a couple planning logistics, but as two people sharing perspectives. Mira didn't assume a role in the decision. Ethan didn't assign one to her. They explored possibilities without attaching expectations. Later that night, Mira lay awake, thinking not about the project, but about herself. She realized how different this felt from past moments of change. She wasn't bracing. She wasn't preparing to adapt silently or to step aside preemptively. She wasn't measuring whether she fit into Ethan's future. She was asking a different question now. What do I want, regardless of what he chooses? The answer came slowly. She wanted a life where she didn't disappear during transitions, where her needs weren't postponed indefinitely for someone else's momentum, where she could remain herself, even as circumstances shifted. That didn't require leaving. It required clarity. The next time they met, Mira brought it up. Not as an ultimatum, not as a negotiation. I want to be honest about something, she said. If your life expands in a way that requires me to shrink to stay connected, I won't do that anymore. Ethan felt the truth of her words immediately. There was no accusation in them, just boundary. I don't want you to shrink, he said. And if I ever ask you to, I want you to tell me. She smiled faintly. I will. The offer eventually turned into a decision, not rushed, not deferred indefinitely. Ethan chose to take it, but with conditions that surprised even him. Fewer relocations, clear boundaries around time, a structure that left room for a life outside of achievement. It wasn't perfect, but it was intentional. Mira watched him make that decision, not as proof of love, but as evidence of growth. And for the first time, she didn't feel like she had to wait for certainty to feel secure. The relationship adjusted again, naturally, imperfectly. Schedules shifted. Expectations were renegotiated. There were moments of friction, moments of fatigue, but the patterns held. Ethan didn't default to control when things felt uncertain. Mira didn't default to silence when things felt demanding. They checked in, they paused, they stayed curious, and slowly, without naming it, something settled between them. Not a promise, not a vow, a rhythm, one built on awareness instead of assumption, on choice instead of certainty. By the time they found themselves walking together one evening, the city quiet around them, neither of them felt the need to define what they had become. Ethan reached for Mira's hand, not to claim it, not to reassure himself, but to ask. She took it, not because she was ready for forever, but because she was ready for now. And for two people who had spent so long protecting themselves in opposite ways, that choice, small, present, unforced, felt like the clearest sign of progress they could have hoped for. The relationship didn't arrive at happiness, the way stories usually promised it would. There was no single morning where everything suddenly felt light. No dramatic moment where doubt vanished and certainty took its place. What emerged instead was something quieter, steadier, and far more unfamiliar to both of them. Peace, not the fragile kind that depended on things going well, the practiced kind that held even when they didn't. Mira noticed it first in her body. She no longer felt the low hum of vigilance when she was with Ethan. She didn't scan his tone for shifts or prepare herself to explain feelings before they were questioned. She didn't feel the need to shrink her needs or expand her patience beyond what felt honest. She felt present. That presence didn't mean everything was easy. It meant she trusted herself enough to stay when things were uncomfortable and to speak when something mattered. Ethan noticed the change in himself differently. He no longer woke up needing certainty to feel grounded. He didn't look for reassurance disguised as plans or milestones. When questions about the future surfaced, he let them exist without rushing to resolve them. He trusted the pattern they were building. That trust wasn't blind. It was earned through repetition, restraint, and repair. There were still moments when old instincts stirred, when Ethan felt the urge to take control during uncertainty, when Mira felt the pull to retreat, when emotional effort felt heavy. The difference now was what happened next. They noticed, and noticing changed everything. One evening, sitting together in Ethan's living room, Mira spoke without preamble. "I think I'm starting to trust that I don't have to disappear to stay close," she said. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He let the words land. "That means more to me than you know," he said quietly, "because I'm learning how to stay close without needing to manage." They shared a small smile, not celebratory, not relieved, just real. This version of love didn't rely on intensity. It didn't demand sacrifice disguised as virtue, didn't confuse endurance with devotion. It asked for something else entirely: consistency, self-awareness, choice. Mira realized she no longer felt responsible for Ethan's emotional balance. She cared deeply, but she didn't carry him. She trusted him to regulate himself, just as she trusted herself to speak when something shifted. Ethan realized he no longer equated love with certainty. He felt steadier, not because everything was defined, but because he knew he could respond honestly to whatever arose. They were no longer trying to fix each other. That, more than anything, changed the tone of their connection. When disagreements surfaced, they didn't escalate quickly or disappear quietly. They moved through them with patience. When one pulled back, the other didn't chase or assume. They checked in instead. Sometimes the answer was space. Sometimes it was closeness. Sometimes it was simply naming uncertainty and letting it breathe. None of it felt dramatic. That, surprisingly, felt like success. Mira thought back to the night that had quietly changed everything. The fundraiser, the moment of recognition, the choice to step back instead of confront. She understood now that the truth revealed that night hadn't been about betrayal. It had been about awareness. Awareness of how easily love could slip into control. How quietly silence could become self-erasure. How necessary it was to notice impact, not just intention. Ethan thought about the vow he'd made silently months ago. She's the one. He no longer felt the need to frame love that way. Not because he cared less, but because he cared differently. Love didn't need to be declared to be real. It needed to be practiced. And what they were practicing now, imperfectly, patiently, felt sustainable. As the evening settled, Ethan reached for Mira's hand. He didn't tighten his grip. He didn't search her face for reassurance. He simply held it. Mira didn't brace herself. She didn't wonder what it meant or where it was headed. She stayed in the moment, allowing connection without obligation. For two people who had once protected themselves in opposite ways, this kind of presence felt radical. Not because it promised forever, but because it honored now. And that, they were learning, was where real love lived. The future didn't arrive with certainty. It arrived the way most real futures do, unfinished, flexible, and shaped by daily choices rather than grand decisions. Months passed without dramatic shifts. Life continued to ask things of them in ordinary ways. Work deadlines, missed call, long days that left little energy for conversation. The difference now was how they met those moments. Mira noticed she no longer defaulted to silence when something felt off. She spoke earlier, sometimes imperfectly, sometimes without fully formed language, but always honestly. And when she spoke, she no longer felt like she was asking permission to exist inside the relationship. That was new. There were still evenings when she needed space, when the effort of connection felt heavy. This time, she didn't disappear. She named it. "I'm not pulling away," she would say. "I just need quiet tonight." Ethan didn't read rejection into it anymore. He didn't counter with reassurance-seeking questions or unspoken expectations. He trusted her words, and when he felt unsettled, when uncertainty stirred or old instincts toward control resurfaced, he named that too. "I'm feeling the urge to plan everything right now," he admitted once, with a faint smile. "And I know that's not about you." Mira laughed softly, not dismissive, but understanding. "Thank you for catching it." They became fluent in each other's patterns, not to avoid them, but to respond with care instead of reaction. The relationship no longer felt like something either of them had to manage. It felt like something they participated in. One evening, as they walked through the city after dinner, Mira slowed her steps. The streets were familiar, the air cool, the pace unhurried. "Do you ever think about how close we came to ending this before it really began?" she asked. Ethan considered the question. "Sometimes," he said, "but I think we would have carried the same patterns into whatever came next, together or apart." She nodded. "I think so, too." They stopped at a crosswalk, the signal blinking red. Ethan looked at her, not searching, not weighing options. "Thank you for not staying quiet when it would have been easier," he said. Mira met his gaze. "Thank you for listening when it would have been easier not to." That exchange held more weight than any promise. They crossed the street hand in hand, unhurried, unconcerned with where the walk led. The city moved around them, busy, indifferent, alive. There was no vow spoken aloud, no declaration that settled everything forever. What they had, instead, was something steadier and harder earned. They knew how to pause. They knew how. They knew how to stay present without losing themselves. They understood now that love wasn't about finding someone who completed you, or someone you could fix, save, or manage. It was about choosing patterns that didn't reopen old wounds, about learning how to care without controlling, how to connect without disappearing, how to stay without clinging. The night that once revealed a devastating truth no longer defined them. It had redirected them, and in that redirection, they had built something quieter than certainty, but stronger. Not a perfect ending, a healthier beginning, one they would keep choosing, one day at a time. Some love stories don't end with certainty. They end with clarity. In this final chapter, no one was fixed, no one was saved, and no one became perfect. Instead, two imperfect people learned something far more valuable: that love isn't about control or sacrifice. It's about awareness, choice, and the courage to stay present without losing yourself. So let me ask you one last question. Have you ever confused silence with strength, or certainty with love? If this story made you reflect, even just a little, tap the like button so more people can find stories that speak to real relationships. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What lesson from this story stayed with you the most? If you've been watching quietly, now's the perfect time to subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson. We tell stories that don't just entertain, but teach, heal, and challenge how we think about love. Because the most powerful love stories aren't the ones that promise forever. They're the ones that teach us how to love better. Starting now. Thank you for staying to the end.